So thank you for being here tonight. This is our monthly, the Arlington Historical Society's monthly, every second Thursday of the month event. It's a free presentation on local history topic. And we're really fortunate tonight to have Nancy Tate, who is the co-chair of the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative. And she is also the former executive director of the National League of Women Voters. Not only are we thrilled that she's here tonight, we are thrilled that she happens to be a member of the Arlington Historical Society. So, yay. Okay, before I turn the podium over to her, I have a couple of brief announcements. One of the reasons why we are hearing tonight about women's suffrage and the effort to get the vote, which was passed, the amendment was passed in 1920, is because we are commemorating 100 years as Arlington County. Arlington County received its name, Arlington. It used to be known as Alexandria County. So we are commemorating the fact that here we are. This is Arlington County. So many of the programs that we have this year are going to be geared towards how did that happen? Who are we? What were we like in 1920? What was going on? And what could county folk look forward to in the next 100 years? So it's very appropriate that we have women's suffrage as a topic tonight. Okay. To that end, one of the things that is going on right this very second is the Arlington Historical Museum has an exhibit that is going to be up for several months, and it is 1920s in 12 objects. 1920s Arlington in 12 objects. So these were objects that have been in our collection as a museum, and we've gone and we've dug deeply to find out what do they mean? Why do we have these? What does this mean for 1920? And what does this mean going forward? So I urge you to come and take a look at the exhibit at the Arlington Historical Museum at 1805 South Arlington Ridge Road. We're open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday afternoons from 1 to 4. Okay, enough PSA. Oh, wait, one more thing. Just one. We are a nonprofit organization. We get no county funding. We are not in their budget in any way, shape, or form. So we rely on donations, and yes, there's a jar on the table out there. And we also rely deeply on being our memberships, our fees for memberships. So give that some serious consideration because March is a great time to sign up to be a member. And if you've got this brochure, this is everything you need to figure out how to do that and why you should do it. Okay, now that's totally done. Make sure you pick up some of the paraphernalia that's out there about upcoming events. And let me tell you a little bit about tonight's presentation. Nancy has done a fabulous article for us in the 2019 edition of the Arlington Historical Magazine. And if you're interested in getting a copy, if you're a member, here's a plug. If you're a member, you're already getting that and you should have already received it. If you're not a member and you'd like a copy, surprise, surprise, we're going to be selling them tonight. And and we might be able to prevail upon Nancy to sign her article for us. Okay, so the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in August 1920. It was 72 years of work on the part of men and women, largely women. It was the greatest expansion of democracy on a single day in U.S. history. I love that. And it's a story that's not very well known, and it's a particularly little known story about what happened in Virginia, and a little bit more about what some Arlingtonians did. So, Nancy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please help me welcome Nancy Tate.
Thank you very much. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Well, the first thing, I'm just going to lay out what I'm going to talk about. First is the very difficult and long fight for the vote that culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment. Then I want to go into a little bit more specifically what happened in Virginia, what happened after the 19th Amendment was passed, and then what are some resources that you can look to because there's going to be a lot going on this year. And as Annette mentioned, this is not the only centennial that'll be occurring this year. The naming of Arlington as Arlington County is also going on as well. So what does the 19th Amendment actually say, and what does it not say? This is what it says. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So that meant that women could no longer be prevented from voting because they were women. However, it did not mean they could not be prevented from voting for other reasons. They had to be a citizen, of course. They had to be, at the time, 21, now 18. And it was certainly the case at the time that they had to have paid their poll taxes. Today, you had to have the right kind of identification. There are a number of other qualifications that often get tied to the vote, but were not covered by this. This related to the fact you could not be denied voting based on the fact you were a woman. It also doesn't allude to the fact that there were women in some states who could already vote before the amendment passed, and we'll get to that in a minute. Some of the key facts here are that it was certified and entered into the U.S. Constitution on August 26, 1920. This was after a 72-year long-fought campaign that started in 1848. Of course, before that, women could not vote, and they had virtually no legal rights in either. But starting in 1848, it was a concerted struggle. It was introduced into Congress 40 times before it passed through the Congress in 1919. As you know, to have an amendment become part of the Constitution, it has to be passed by each House of Congress, and it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which in 1920 was 36 states. So the 19th Amendment was ratified by 36 states, but it only passed by one vote in the last state, which was Tennessee. And it only passed by that one vote because one young legislator switched his vote after receiving a letter from his mother. You cannot get better drama than this story. I also want to point out that the women's suffrage movement was not a movement of women against men. It was a movement of women and men who supported the full franchise for women in opposition to men and some women who opposed that. So what's the significance? What are some of the key points of significance? It enfranchised 26 million women, which was roughly 1/2 of the population, which was the greatest expansion of democracy on a single day in American history, and in fact of much of world history. The amendment provided constitutional protection for women's right to vote rather than reliance on state or local laws. There were some state and local laws, but as we all know, laws can be changed. Having the right to vote enabled women to win other rights over time. And it was a major social justice movement, although this is not a term they used at the time, and it did influence many that came later. Some of the tactics, particularly the peaceful demonstrating principles that they used were modeled again in the civil rights movement. So this is a picture of victory. The woman at the top is Alice Paul. She is standing, unfurling a banner at the headquarters of the National Women's Party, which is on Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. She had been sewing a star every time a state ratified the amendment. And after getting a phone call that the Tennessee had ratified, she sewed on the last star and unfurled this banner off of the balcony. And here, of course, are a lot of cheering supporters. So what did it take to win? Well, it took a lot of different things. It took a lot of very different political strategies. It took lots of different state legislation, state referenda for many years. And in fact, the state-by-state effort was the dominant strategy for much of the movement. It also took, of course, the fight to get a constitutional amendment, a federal constitutional amendment. The suffragists also undertook a number of legal challenges. They went to court in the 1870s, trying to make the case that they had rights under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as citizens, that they should be able to vote. The courts decided no, they could not. Several of them periodically would go and try to vote to force the issue in the public sphere. Susan B. Anthony went to vote in 1871. She was arrested because it was illegal for women to vote. So it took organized lobbying in all these states and all these communities around the country for 72 years. And in fact, it took 900 separate local, state, and national campaigns. And it took 900, not 36 or some other smaller number, because that's how many times they lost. They kept having to do it over and over again. They'd launch a campaign in one state, they'd get defeated. They'd go for something in the state assembly and win there, but lose in the state senate and so forth. So it took 900. What else did it take? Well, it took public support. And one of the rights that women did have was their right under the First Amendment to petition. And these suffragists were excellent petitioners. And they went to every level of government. They went around their states. At this period of time, of course, the country was very rural. They would go in buckboards. They would go on horse. Later on, they went in Model Ts, collecting signatures all over to take to the different office holders, making their case for the vote. As time went on, they started holding some marches to bring public attention to the fact that there were a number of women who were peacefully demonstrating for the vote. The most famous of these was the 1913 march in Washington, D.C., where somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in well-organized, solemn rows, again, making the case that they deserved the vote. They were quite expert, actually, at the use of the press, and there were a lot of newspapers that supported the suffrage movement. Things like marches were put on often just to get press attention and to take the case to the larger public. They did start their own newspapers so that they could circulate information among their networks nationwide. Over time, they started picketing. There was a group of women who picketed the White House. These were called the Silent Sentinels. They picketed 6 days a week, 6 days a week, starting in January 1917 on. Some of those women ended up being jailed because under the charge of obstructing traffic on the sidewalk, and were then sent to either the D.C. jail or the Occoquan workhouse. They were roughed up quite a bit there. Some of them went on hunger strikes, and when they went on hunger strikes, they were force-fed. And when I say force-fed, I mean that large metal clamps were put on their jaws to force their jaws open so that raw eggs could be poured down their throat. Sometimes fluids were put up their nose, because even though the powers that be did not have a problem with abusing the women, they didn't want them to die on their watch, so they were just trying to keep them alive. All right, this is a picture of the 1913 march. You can see the Capitol building in the background. You can see women on horses, women carrying flags and banners. They had floats. They had women acting at tableau, basically, up at the Treasury building, waiting for the suffrage parade to arrive. But they decided to hold this on the day before Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration, when the town was full of revelers, supporters, whatnot. So most of the crowd, you can't see them real well, but you see people in the background. These were mostly men. And at a certain point, they just couldn't take it anymore. And this was just too many women, too many people, wanting too many new rights. And so they disrupted the whole march. They pulled down the banners. They pushed a lot of the women aside. They destroyed the floats. The DC police did not do anything to help, but ultimately troops from Fort Myer were brought over to restore peace. This is a picture of the silent sentinels. It shows you these women in this case, they're in their long winter coats, standing there. Their sashes often look like the sash I'm wearing now, which says Votes for Women. Sometimes it had the name of their state, sometimes it had the name of their university. They came from all over the country. They had these sorts of banners. I think you can see the one that's the most famous banner, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And they continued to stand there, and for a while, President Wilson tolerated this. But as World War I got underway, this started to be seen as traitorous activity. They started to ramp up their language and started referring to him as Kaiser Wilson. And this sort of provoked him. And so then the arrest started. But the women considered themselves political prisoners. They refused to pay the fines. And every time some of them were hauled away to jails, others filled their place in the line. So who were the suffragists? Well, the movement was initiated in 1848 by the abolitionists. By abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and of course others. The leaders of the women's suffrage movement were mostly white educated women, and this is true for the whole time period. But the movement also included African American women, Asian and Native American women, and men. And in fact, there were men in some cities, including in particular New York City, that formed their own leagues of men in support of women's suffrage. And they had banners and they would march along with the women. The suffrage movement also brought together other social issues that were going on because a lot of people realized that once they had the vote, they'd be better able to work on the other causes that were important to them. And some of those included the temperance movement, the anti-lynching movement, and the labor movement. So here are pictures of some of the original suffragists. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she and her husband and some others from the Seneca Falls area of New York had gone to the World Abolitionist Society convention in London in the early 1840s. And despite all her work in this movement, the convention refused to seat her or the other women because they were women. And this was just one insult too many for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So she came back to Seneca Falls, and within a few years, along with other women, they put on a women's rights convention. And 200 to 300 people came, including Frederick Douglass. And she wrote and offered to the group a declaration of sentiments, which was organized and structured along the same lines as the Declaration of Independence, meaning that it was a list of the abuses or the injustices that were perpetuated against women by the male-dominated society. Only one of those included the right to vote, and that was one of the most controversial because even for these supporters at that early stage, this was considered just such a radical idea, they just weren't sure they could get behind it. Susan B. Anthony was not actually at that convention, but they teamed up very shortly thereafter and worked closely together for about the next 40 or 50 years. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married and had 7 children and stayed home in Seneca Falls most of the time. And Susan B. Anthony traveled extensively around the country. She was single. She would give upwards of 170 speeches per year, traveling at least 13,000 miles per year. And again, this is starting even in the 1870s when transportation was more difficult. Frederick Douglass, of course, the best-known abolitionist of his era, was always a suffragist himself. He was at the convention. The movement did start to split after the 14th and 15th Amendments that expanded a number of privileges, but including the vote for men of color and conditions of previous servitude, but not women, expressly excluded women. And this was a hard pill for some of the women suffragists. But in fact, these three kept up a lifetime friendship. And if you've ever been to Frederick Douglass's house in Southeast DC, you can see a picture of Susan B. Anthony on the wall. Sojourner Truth, who of course I'm sure you're familiar with, another very active anti-slavery activist, also spoke often about the importance of women's rights and getting the vote. This slide is telling you that it took 3 generations of women and men of the suffragists to reach the goal. So these folks that I've just shown you previously had died at least 10 years before the amendment was passed. And in the latter years, there were 2 major suffrage organizations, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, and the National Woman's Party, which was a smaller breakoff group. At its height, NAWSA had 2 million members across the country. It was the largest volunteer organization in the country at that time. It had a state-by-state focus. It was very focused on organizing at that level. Members of the National Woman's Party, which was headed by Alice Paul, got impatient with that technique and felt that more dramatic tactics were needed. And it was her ideas behind both the major marches and the Silent Sentinels. Carrie Chapman Catt was the leader of NAWSA. She was a very significant figure. She was well known around the country and internationally at that time. But it has to be acknowledged that there were racial tensions throughout the suffrage movement, just as there were racial tensions throughout American society at that time, and of course, including today. So in the suffrage case, this took on a variety of different forms. One of them was that the contributions of women of color were minimized. So one example is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt it was important to start documenting this chapter of American history, the struggle for the vote. And she wrote a lot of text to cover this, but she only covered the activities of the white women's organizations. Most of the black women's organizations were separate organizations, although they were fighting for the same cause. So their stories were not told, and many of us didn't even know about those stories until very recently. Another example is that in that major 1913 march, Alice Paul asked some of the black women's cohorts to march at the back of the parade. Washington, D.C. was a southern city at that point. Of course, the South was in opposition to the amendment, and they were trying to minimize antagonizing potential allies. Some of those groups did reluctantly agree to march at the back, but several of the African-American suffragists, such as Ida B. Wells, refused and marched with their own state delegations. In addition to that, though, some of the suffragists did make blatantly racist statements. This is certainly the case with both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the latter years, like in the 1890s, perhaps partly because of their frustration that they were still excluded. And certainly right at the end of the struggle, as they were pushing the states to pushing ratification through the states, the 2 major organizations had what, they didn't call it this exactly, but they had a Southern strategy, which was to try to push for the vote, and they stopped their demands for racial equality, even though they had stood up for that earlier. They kind of let that go in the effort to further their own tactic. So here's some pictures of those later suffragists: Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, who's in the middle there, Ida B. Wells. Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul seriously disliked each other. These 2 women did not get along at all, and both personally and because they favored completely different strategies. But the combination of them, the more grassroots organizing, which became very important in the ratification effort, and the more dramatic marches and picketing and so forth together, I think most historians agree had worked quite well overall. So today, of course, the fact that women should have the vote is sort of a given. Nobody even asks or talks about that. But why was it such a big deal? Who was opposed to this? Well, of course, in the United States, like most countries, there was a long history of very heavily gendered standards about what was appropriate for women and what was appropriate for men. And women's sphere was the home, and men's sphere was everything else, including anything in the public sphere, even the act of voting. So that had been true for a long time throughout American history, and it was starting to be lessened somewhat after the Civil War and as industrialization started moving through the U.S. and more women were getting educated. But it still existed. But it would be a big mistake to think that it was just social norms that were the main opposition. There was big organized opposition and big money going into the fight to prevent women from voting. There were industries that felt particularly threatened, such as the liquor industry, and the manufacturers, particularly in the textile industries, who relied on child labor. In both cases, they were afraid, of course, that women voters would vote for different types of laws that would curtail their business interests. Political bosses in the big cities of the North and in the Midwest, even though there might have been different political parties, they, of course, were all men. They all knew the sort of inside game. They really weren't that keen on the idea of a bunch of women just showing up and voting and telling them what to do. So they decided the simplest thing was to not let them show up. Let's just keep it the status quo. A major point in building momentum for the amendment was in 1917 when the Tammany Hall operation in New York finally withdrew its opposition and supported the amendment, allowing all the women in New York to vote in the 1917 state referendum. That was huge because that was the biggest state. The white Southern establishment was just adamantly against expanding the vote. Their theory being, why would they want to expand the vote and give the franchise to black women when they were working so hard to deny the vote to black men? So they were adamant in their opposition. But racism was not limited to the South or towards African Americans. In the West, there were fears about enfranchising the Chinese immigrants who had come for the railroads and so forth. And other parts of the country where there were large immigrant populations, particularly of where the population seemed uneducated, and others in those communities felt threatened and were not too comfortable having them vote. And it has to be said that there were some white upper-class women who were opposed to getting the vote as well. And some of them even organized organizations in opposition to women getting the vote. These tended to be women who either deeply identified with the notion that had been the prevailing notion previously of femininity, and they were uncomfortable with this change. But also they were often in well-connected families where their voice could be heard by talking to their fathers or their husbands or whatnot. But even though there were not very many of these, the fact that they existed was a good front for these other groups because it was a lot easier, and in a lot of the anti-propaganda put the spotlight on the women who were saying we don't want the vote, even though the money and a lot of the organization was coming from these other interests. So this is a great map. So I know that you can't see all of these codes, but you can see all the brown states on one side of the map. There were 15 states that had already voted at the state level to grant women full voting rights before the amendment even started moving through the Congress in 1919. Starting with Wyoming in 1869. Wyoming enfranchised women when it was still a territory, and when it shifted to become a state, it insisted on keeping that provision in its constitution. And you had Utah, Idaho, and so forth, slowly the whole West. Now, of course, this is a lot of land, but at the time it wasn't that many people. If you look at some of the states that are in the light blue colors in the middle, these are states that had granted women the right to vote for president. So it was okay with their male legislators if women in the state voted for president, but not okay if they were going to vote for state or local officials like them. So that's how you get a map with all these different subsets of different voting laws. And then you can see all of the deep blue states in the South and the Eastern seaboards that never voted for women's suffrage. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to Virginia. So Virginia was actually the only colony that explicitly excluded women from voting. But by the time it got serious here about the suffrage conversation, starting in 1912, the General Assembly did have several opportunities to pass their own state law enfranchising women in Virginia, and they defeated them each time. They defeated them overwhelmingly, but not unilaterally, meaning there were men in Virginia at the time who were supporting suffrage, but not enough of them. On February 12, 1920, the General Assembly defeated the proposed federal amendment when it came through on the Virginia side. But that wasn't enough for the Virginia legislators, who joined with other southern states to try some legal efforts to head off other states from adopting it, those states who hadn't voted yet. Maryland was one of those other states, by the way. The race issue, the importance of maintaining white supremacy was absolutely critical. It just drove everything in Virginia. The 1902 state constitution had already moved things in that direction. The Jim Crow laws were already in place. And by 1912, a separate anti-suffrage organization was formed to put out the propaganda and so forth to fight any chance for suffrage in Virginia. The culture of quote-unquote Southern womanhood also made it harder for a lot of women who might have been otherwise inclined to know exactly what they could do in this context. But finally, just in conclusion here, we can say that in February 1952, the Virginia General Assembly ratified, in a symbolic vote, ratified the 19th Amendment that, of course, had already been passed 32 years earlier. So in summary, the reason that women in Virginia got the right to vote in 1920 was because men in 36 other states voted to give them that right. But that doesn't mean that there weren't people here in Virginia who were trying very hard, and there were. So in the 1870s and 1890s, there were limited efforts. In 1909, the Equal Suffrage League was founded. It was small at the beginning, but it grew quite significantly. It had these numbers for these types of groups this far back are always kind of hard to pin down, but they were well over 20,000 members and had somewhere between 145 and 175 chapters all over the Commonwealth. This was known as the largest non-military organization in Virginia at that time, and it's presumed that it was the largest suffrage organization in the South. So the Equal Suffrage League did lots of different things. They joined with the larger national Nassau group. They did all sorts of their own petitioning and marching and so forth, all sorts of different techniques. And they were so successful enough to actually be able to bring the suffrage issue to the floor of the General Assembly 3 times. It was always defeated, but just getting the Assembly to take a vote on it was significant. But in addition, there was also a Virginia branch of this smaller National Women's Party, and Virginia did have its own Men's Equal Suffrage League. So the Virginia suffragists were mostly based in Richmond. The most well-known at the time was Lila Meade Valentine. She came from a well-established family there. She was an active social reformer and active in many other causes. She was giving over 100 suffrage speeches a year. And at one point, she led a march of 200 suffragists to the doors of the governor's office to show him what the level of support of women that he would respect and to influence him. And among those women sitting with her were descendants of Thomas Jefferson and George Mason. Adele Clark was another suffragist. She was an artist. She not only worked throughout Virginia, but she went up to Washington, D.C. She picketed. She was one of the silent sentinels. She picketed there. She was jailed and later became the first president of the Virginia League of Women Voters. There's actually a statue of Adele Clark that has just been unveiled in November on the grounds of the Capitol in Richmond in the area called Voices from the Garden, which is going to have 12 different historic women, and the first 6 are there now, and Adele Clark is one of them. Gertrude Crocker was actually from Illinois, but she came to D.C. and picketed the White House and was jailed. But I guess she didn't hold it against Virginia, having been jailed at Occoquan. And she later moved to Arlington and owned the little tea house on Arlington Ridge Road that many of you may be familiar with. So this is a picture, one of the group shots of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. They have you can't see it too well, but they're actually, some of them are sitting in one of these sort of Model T cars, and the rest are joined around them. They often festoon these cars with all sorts of banners and ribbons so that they would cause quite a stir when they came to town. Here is a picture of the 2 of these women, Lila Mead Valentine and Adele Clark. Some of the other suffragists that are worth noting, one was Maggie Walker, a very well-known African-American woman in Richmond. She was very active in the African-American community there. She was the first African-American woman in the United States to form a bank and be president of that bank. And her home in Richmond is actually a National Historic Site. There was also Dr. Kate Waller Barrett. She was best known for being the head of the Florence Crittenden Homes for Unwed Mothers, but she was an active suffragist, and she is the person for whom Arlington's Barrett Elementary School is named. Now, it was quite hard to actually identify people that we could tell for sure actually lived in Arlington County the way that we know Arlington County today. That's because up until March of 1920, there was no Arlington County. It was Alexandria County, and actually some of the borders were different. But we did find Mrs. Henry Lockman. And we know about her from this article that appeared in the Washington Post, where it specifically mentions she lives at Clarendon, Virginia, so at least we know that that's Arlington. She was the chairman of the Alexandria and Fairfax Equal Suffrage League, and this article is mentioning how she was organizing a formal call on her Virginia member of Congress. But if you look down at the middle of this quote, it says, "The call on the Virginia congressman will be followed by the organization of deputations who will call on every representative and senator before the 2 bodies convene in December with a demand for a statement of their position on the constitutional amendment proposed for universal suffrage." So it's a good illustration that there were women right here in Arlington doing their very best to move things forward. So the amendment, of course, did pass, but what happened afterwards? Well, even though this was a federal constitutional amendment, still not all women were enfranchised. For instance, Asian women were not enfranchised. In fact, Chinese women didn't get the vote, just along with Chinese men, until 1952 because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which said that Chinese immigrants could not be citizens. So, of course, if you're not a citizen, you can't vote. Same sort of situation applied to Native Americans who were considered citizens of their tribes and not of the United States. Of course, we know that the District of Columbia, neither men nor women could vote for president until 1961. Similar sort of situation applied to Puerto Rico. But at least there was some energy right away after the amendment did pass. And one of them was the founding of the League of Women Voters, which actually was founded 100 years ago from tomorrow. February 14th, 1920 was when Nassau and Carrie Chapman Catt formed the League of Women Voters in anticipation of the fact that having the constitutional right to vote would not in and of itself be sufficient, that women would need to be educated on how the election process worked, as well as on issues and candidates, and they would need skills to continue to advocate for the causes that were important to them. Alice Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was introduced in Congress from 1923. It was introduced in every Congress from then to 1972, when it did pass through the Congress. We know that the road to ratification of the ERA is long and it is not completed. In the last few weeks, Virginia did just pass the amendment, making it the 38th state, which at this point would be the 3/4 of the vote, the count needed. However, as you know, there are issues about the earlier deadlines and so forth, so it is not yet fully ratified. But in terms of the election of 1920, data on this is not real good because there wasn't anybody keeping really good data. But it appeared that there was relatively low female turnout. It wasn't terrible, but certainly wasn't the avalanche that either the supporters or the opponents had expected. And turnout continued to be low, as did the role of the activism of women in politics for a number of years, and it only grew slowly over time. But since 1982, women's turnout in elections in the United States has exceeded that of men's every year in every election. Women, of course, have been entering politics in recent years in increasing numbers, and increasingly they're winning. And legislation, as a result of all these things, has increasingly been passed over time relating to women's issues. So the story of the evolution of women's voting in the country it's not perfect, but it's not too bad. That's not really the case with, if you look at the status of voting since then, in the last 100 years. As we've already said, there were repressive Jim Crow voting laws already on the books in 1920, property requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests, other encumbrances. Those continued to well into the 1960s. It wasn't until the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes in 1964, and that was just for federal elections. Some states, and I think Virginia may have been one of them, continued to allow poll taxes or to require poll taxes on state and local elections, but that was at least all eliminated with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 from 21. Of course, this was driven by the Vietnam War, because it became more obvious than apparently it had been in the past that if young men were mature enough to go and fight, they were mature enough to express their views at the ballot box. But so things sort of continued on in a sort of a status quo kind of way until 2000, and particularly 2010, where new restrictions have been passed on voting by a number of states. It's a very long list of the different laws that have gone into effect, but they include things such as more restrictive voter identification, more frequent purging of voter lists, greater restrictions on early and absentee voting. And not only are these laws in place, but they consistently have a disproportionately negative impact on the turnout of younger voters, of non-white populations, and of low-income people. And then as sort of an added sort of complexity to our voting system, since 2016 have been all the cybersecurity issues that most of us had never even heard of prior to that, as well as the social media misinformation campaigns. So there's a lot of work to be done in the voting area, more generally. If you look very quickly at what happened specifically in Virginia after the amendment passed, the National League of Women Voters was founded in February. The Virginia League was formed in November of that year, or October, actually. The League, along with other groups, were very active in registering women to vote. The estimates are that they collectively registered somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 women. Turnout on election day was about the same as the rest of the country, and probably worse, actually, in light of the racial component. I do want to point out for anybody who has read my magazine article that one of my sources was incorrect. That source reported that women in Virginia did not actually get to vote until 1922. That is not correct, but it is the case that in Mississippi and Georgia, that even though the women had the constitutional right to vote, somehow the state government had so many logistical problems and administrative conditions that they just couldn't get it ready in time for women to vote. So it seemed that might have pertained to Virginia, but I think that it didn't. I think women apparently were voting in Virginia in 1920. In 1923, so there was some enthusiasm here, the first 2 women were elected to the House of Delegates. By 1933, 6 women had been elected to the House of Delegates. But for the next 20 years, no women were elected in Virginia politics. Until 1953, when our very own Catherine Stone of Arlington was elected to the House. Took about 20 years, but the first woman was elected to the Virginia Senate, coming from one of the southern counties in Virginia. Almost 20 years after that, 1992, Leslie Byrne became the first woman elected to Congress from Virginia. And as we've just said, in 2020, just a few short weeks ago, the Equal Rights Amendment passed in Virginia. So just a few things about the League of Women Voters. As I mentioned, the National League, which we call the League of Women Voters of the United States, was created by the suffragists in 1920. It was created to educate and to advocate, particularly all of the women who were becoming voters for the first time. That is still the mission of the League. That is still what leagues at every level do. There's a state league in every state and approximately 800 local leagues around the country. The Virginia State League was created in 1920, but during the Depression, it got too hard to maintain, and so it sort of faded away, but returned in strength in 1946 and has been going on ever since. There was a League of Women Voters created in Arlington in 1923. It had several component parts based on the residential areas, with Cherrydale and Clarendon being the most active. That also struggled during the Depression, but in 1944, 17 committed women formed the joint Arlington-Alexandria League. They came together, even though it was during the war, still during World War II, but to start to deal with the issues facing their communities. And they found that each of the communities, they wanted to be able to focus on each of their own communities in more depth, so that's why they separated into 2 separate leagues. And that's the way it has remained until actually about a year ago when, because the Arlington League has actually become more active, a lot of residents of Alexandria actually joined the Arlington League. So the Arlington League today, and we have some Arlington League members here who can raise their hands. Okay. And there are some materials outside on the table telling you about the League. Last year, 2019, was our 75th anniversary. We still are focused on education and advocacy, but of course not on all the same issues as before, but knowing what the election laws are, knowing the candidates, knowing the issues, and advocating for the ERA, for a lot of improvements in the election laws and so forth. We currently have over 200 members in our league, and we'd be more than happy if any of the rest of you would like to join us. Here, I think, is a lovely poster that was created at the founding of the league. It was used around the country. It was also used in Virginia. It has sort of Lady Liberty gently pointing to the Capitol building in the background, sort of gently showing that woman and her little girl the way forward as they're putting their ballot in their ballot box. There have been a number of prominent Arlington League members who are also prominent in Arlington itself. Catherine Stone, who we've already mentioned, was the first president of the Arlington League. Ellen Bosman, of course, Congressman Joe Fisher, Mary Margaret Whipple, Delegate Karen Darner, Judy Conley. Many key folks have either were or still are members of the Arlington League. Joe Fisher was immediately joined the League when membership was open to men, which was in 1974. And he was the National League president at the time, put out a press statement commending him as the League's first male member of Congress and thanking him for joining. So for folks who would like to know more about the suffrage centennial, there are a lot of great exhibits all over the place. Downtown right now and throughout 2020, there's a great exhibit at the National Archives and also at the Library of Congress. There's the Lucy Burns Museum, which is a small museum at what is now called the Workhouse Art Center, what is left of the building of the Occoquan Workhouse, that focuses primarily on the suffragists who were incarcerated there. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture, as well as the Library of Virginia, are both have created exhibits that are opening in March during Women's History Month, focusing on the suffrage centennial. There are already many books and articles. There will be at least 2 different television shows, one of them coming out that's being produced by Steven Spielberg. Arlington County has created its own group called, which is Women Work, and they're having a centennial celebration series where every month there's a different program that will have something to do with the centennial or women voting. I have put materials out on the table here. You can learn more about that from either the county website or the library website. If you want to see your name carved in stone and a memorial, you could donate some funds to the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, which is an outdoor memorial to the full suffrage movement, not only to the folks who were the women who were incarcerated. Ground has already broken on that. Construction's about to begin. The ribbon cutting will take place on August 26th, and funding is still being gratefully accepted. And you can help if you want to. 2020 has a lot of other things going on besides the suffrage centennial. As you heard earlier, it's also the centennial of Arlington County being called Arlington County. And in addition to the Historical Society, Arlington County government is structuring a variety of programs, again, once a month over the course of this year, to focus on the last 100 years of Arlington County, the different communities, the different developments, and you can see that, you can find out that information on the county website, arlingtonva.us/100. I think I got that right. Of course, also this year, you can join the League of Women Voters, of course, any other groups. We all know this is a very big election year. There's always, people are always encouraged to help register other first-time voters in particular, to serve as poll workers. And of course, as a League member, I would be remiss if I didn't urge this population, this audience, even though I know you probably don't need it, to be sure to vote. So thank you very much. That's the end. Any questions? Yes.
Well, it's not a question so much, but in 1976, I participated as a silent sentinel in front of the White House for the ERA.
Yeah, very good.
We dressed as much as we could, like the women in the
Yes.
for suffrage, and we had the same banner that you have, but
Yes,
it
that's
wasn't
my
for votes. It was
sash,
for
and there's the
ERA.
suffrage colors there. Yes, very good.
And I was living in New Jersey at the time, and we went to see Alice Paul was still living in a nursing home in New Jersey.
Yeah, wow,
And
gosh.
we didn't get in to see her, but we waved to her from the balcony.
Okay, very good. This
So
is,
she lived until 19.
yes, she lived at one of the houses, which is now the Belmont Paul Women's Memorial Monument House on the hill. She lived there for a long time, till close to her death. Anybody else? Yes.
What's the level of enthusiasm about the Centennial across the country? I think sometimes we're in DC, we see a lot of things that may not be going on in the rest of the country, but do you have a sense of the level of enthusiasm across the country?
Well, like most things across the country, it's varied. But there are a lot of things going on there, and there's a lot of separate groups of individuals who are putting on their own programs. There is not going to be any major national thing here in DC, but there's some of the states. There are states' women's commissions who will be putting on special events in their states. There's one group of women skydivers who are going to come around to different events in different states and drop out of the sky, either in suffrage clothes or with suffrage banners. There is a lot going on, but there has not been anyone to organize it on such a national scale that you can easily see. One of the organizations that I am part of, this 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, and which my co-chair, Krista Jones, back there is the other co-chair, that's one of the purposes that we try to serve, is to share information so that anybody, Girl Scout troops, local leagues, bar associations, county governments, anybody can commemorate this occasion in whatever way seems most appropriate to them. So there is a lot going on, but there could be more. That's why I'm doing these speeches. Yes.
Have you helped other countries with their women voting, or have you helped other countries set up League of Women's Voters?
She asked whether there are League of Women Voters in other countries.
No. Have you, as the League of American League of Women Voters, have you helped other countries set up the same type of organization?
We have not set up, so there's been 100 years of League's history. The League has done a lot periodically going into other countries and helping manage their election process, such as after the fall of the Soviet Union, League people were in a lot of those former Soviet states helping to set up different voting systems and actually serving as poll workers. We were not usually trying to set up, we talked to people about creating new League of Women Voters, but in many other countries, groups like that are considered much more partisan. The League is a nonpartisan organization, and so our culture didn't always fit with that in other countries, but we have done a lot of international work over time on the broader topic of voting and democracy. Yes.
Yeah. This morning I was listening to C-SPAN. They were talking about in Congress about the Equal Rights Amendment, extending the vote, and most of the speakers, of course, were speaking in favor of it, but some were not. And one who is not kept pointing to the 14th Amendment, as nobody read the 14th Amendment. You mentioned that it didn't open voting to women. Why? I'm not familiar enough to know. Why would that even be a sensible argument?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know why. I know why it was used in the hopes that it would expand the vote for women sooner. I'm not sure what the argument is about why reading the 14th Amendment now. I guess the argument is that was supposed to protect people's rights more broadly. And so if you believe that, then I guess the case would be that you wouldn't need the ERA. But of course, that is typically has not historically been the case. And so the argument has been that you do need this additional level of constitutional protection, even though there have been many laws that do protect women. It's not the same as a constitutional amendment. So I hadn't heard that this morning, but that must be the argument. But that can't be, that's not going to be a well-supported argument. The usual arguments had to do with the expiration of the deadline and what about the states that rescinded. And they're going to fight about this both through the courts and trying to get the Congress to just change the deadline. Yes, over there.
Yes, the National Portrait Gallery has a really nice display of the original banners and sashes and a lot of these things about the amendment. And they talk about the key players. They talk about a number of lesser-known figures. I was just curious if there's any historical records about any more aggressive chapters that were considered more, I wouldn't say violent, but were not of the passive nature. They went above and beyond and might have not have been considered, hey, you guys are just even too radical for us. Were there any stories of such groups in different states?
Well, and to use the word kind of radical and more violent, that was a technique used in Britain. So British suffragists and in Britain, these women were called suffragettes. We never used that term in the United States. Suffragettes were women who actually, from like 1902 to at least 1914, were willing to destroy property, throw bricks through windows. They tried to set somebody's house, I think might have been the Prime Minister's house, on fire. I mean, they were really trying to get attention. One of them threw themselves in front of the King's horse in one of those major horse races. There was nothing like that in the United States, at least that has been recorded in any of the scholarly works. These women took a lot of abuse. It was not a passive sort of activity where you just have a nice discussion with somebody and everybody sort of nods. But that kind of physical violence did not occur. The Portrait Gallery did have a wonderful exhibit, but that is over now. The other two still remain. But all of them are doing a much better job of telling some of these untold stories than had occurred in the past. Yes?
Do you know why they chose the colors of purple, white, and yellow for their banners?
Well, I used to know this, but it's confusing. The different arms of the movement had somewhat different colors. So she's asking, what is the reason for these different colors? At the time, for one reason I have trouble remembering this is because colors and flowers had a lot of meaning in the 1800s that they don't have today. So purple was like, I think, loyalty, and white was purity, and gold was something else. And so they very consciously picked combinations. They also watched what the British women had used, but theirs, I think, the British used green as well as white and perhaps purple. So it was the National Women's Party in particular who used the purple, white, and gold. You'll see a lot of times now, but they almost all use white. And so that's why women members of Congress now often wear all white when they are showing their support for women and for voting. So that was more generic. These colors, on this banner came a little later and were very purposeful. But those allegorical references are something that actually escaped me at this point.
I had also heard it was gold, white, violet, give women the vote.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that could be true. That could be true. Yeah. Anything else? I must just say on this, there is so much about this whole movement. It's so inspirational. These women and men, but predominantly women. It was a women-led movement. they had to not only come up with all these, it's not as if all these strategies always existed and they just thought they'd use them now. In many cases, they were creating them. They were creating their own language. They were creating their own visual imagery. There were no women in political life, so they used images like Joan of Arc, like the woman, Lady Liberty, in one of these things to kind of elevate their cause. They had to think of that. They had to think of the colors. They had to really think about how to sell their message, how to really convince the rest of the American population. And sometimes they took a different tact, actually, on the messaging side, and to show how getting the vote would just be good for America, because just as women can clean up the house and, you know, keep the kids clean, they can clean up America, and it's not threatening at all. And so there was many postcards and stationery with little cartoon figures, sort of the Cupid doll looking images, and cute little valentines, actually, with a little Cupid doll girl saying to a little Cupid doll boy, "No, not till I get the vote." And so they worked every angle. They worked every angle. Thank you very much.